everyone. My name is Laura Rupel, and welcome to the second season of the Detours in Music podcast. For the first episode of the second season, I wanted to start with my podcast heroes, I guess, and those are Galit Kaunitz and Jaqui Wilson, the hosts of the Oboe and Bassoon podcast, Double Reed Dish. I hope you enjoy.
I'm Galit Kaunitz, and I teach oboe at the University of Southern Mississippi, currently assistant professor of oboe, and this coming year I'm going up for tenure, so hopefully soon to be associate professor of oboe.
I am Jaqui Wilson, the recently appointed assistant professor of bassoon at Washington State University.
And the reason I know about both of you is because you are the hosts and creators of Double Reed Dish podcasts.
That is correct.
Yeah. The one and only. How did you both get your starts in music?
Well, my dad is actually a classical musician, not by career, although he probably would have if he could have, if a certain someone hadn't come along and sapped him of all of his money resources. That would be me. But yeah, my dad is a musician and he plays violin, and so when I was a kid I wanted to play violin. I started really young, 7 years old, and I realized I didn't like it, so then I switched to the clarinet and I didn't like that either. And then I went to a Hartford symphony concert with my dad, and I heard an oboe for the first time, and I was like, I don't know what that is, but I want that. And he was like, okay, great, as long as it's not a double bass, because I had been begging him to let me play the double bass, and he had said no, which Jaqui tells me is my dad caring for me.
Think about the plane tickets. Think about all that, like,
it's a very good
double bass. No, ma'am.
So yeah, that's how I got my start.
I actually was an oboist to start off with, although that's generous. I blew into the oboe during band class. I just went into band because I thought it was interesting, and it was one of the electives that was available at junior high. And I was never serious about it. I was never like intensely focused. I had no private lessons. And in fact, I come from a low income family, especially at that time. And so it was just something I did for fun, you know, like played in the band class and then forgot about it. I was one of those kids who like left their oboe under their bed for all of summer break and then was like, oh, you know, this reed'll do. And it's like 5 years old.
This whole thing.
But when you're like that, you are not playing first and getting a bunch of amazing opportunities. And so my going into my junior year, there were some spots open in the Wind Symphony, which is like the good audition band. Mm-hmm. And a freshman beat me out because I sounded horrible and I didn't care about being good at what I did. And so I didn't make it into the wind ensemble, and I was like devastated because socially that's like such a, like to be an upperclassman in the baby band was like devastating to me. And my band director said, well, listen, I'm graduating a couple bassoons. It's somewhat similar, and I know you're wanting to go to college, and I think it could open some doors. So I'm going to send you home for the summer with a bassoon, and you know, you need to practice it, you need to get good, but I think it could create some scholarship opportunities. So if you want to be in the good band, this is your summer to kind of make it happen. And so I opened up this case with an instrument that looked like something out of a Dr. Seuss book, and the rest is history.
Yeah. How similar did you find the transition? Because I would not describe oboe and bassoon as similar personally.
Well, they are and they aren't. I remember the first time I blew into a bassoon feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm like really doing something. Like the resistance level of the oboe, especially when you're like playing on nasty store-bought reeds, was like, oh my gosh. So I felt like, you know, this instrument says yes, like Galit says the oboe says no. The bassoon says yes for the most part.
That's a
they are similar. I mean, when people say, like, get mad, like, oh, don't call the bassoon a bass oboe, I say, but it is. Like, The bassoon is what you get if you keep making the oboe longer and longer and longer. Yeah, the staple is a bocal. It's so the concept of half holing and that type of stuff was comparable enough. It was enough of a challenge, but familiar enough. So yeah, I found him to be related enough in all the right ways.
Not in the wrong ways. When did both of you realize you wanted to pursue music after just playing in bands for fun?
I didn't realize it until the summer before my senior year. I went to Lucerne Music Center in upstate New York. My oboe teacher, bless her, was so frustrated with me all the time because I just wouldn't practice. Like I would practice just enough so that she could see potential, but not enough to actually realize the potential. So it was just incredibly frustrating for her. And she finally convinced me to go to this camp. And we learned the Tchaikovsky Sixth Symphony. And we performed one movement per week. And so it was very in-depth, and it was my first time. It wasn't my first time playing in an orchestra, but it was my first time playing in an orchestra with a conductor and peers who were passionate about it. And the music was phenomenal. And I was surrounded by people who were going to, I forget what it's called, but it was basically like pre-college, but in Philadelphia. And so I was surrounded by all of these incredible young musicians, and I just kind of light bulb went off, and I was like, oh yeah, I want to do this. This is pretty great. I want to do this. And so I talked to my oboe teacher there at the time, and I said, do you think I can do this? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, okay, what do I do? He's like, practice all the time. I was like, okay. So then I became an obsessive practicer, and I had to pretty much cram everything in to get ready for college auditions, and quit the color guard, which was a very big deal at the time. And yeah, that was kind of it. I'm a person who was very much motivated by the you're behind stimulus. You're behind. And that, you know, it's both good and bad, because when do you stop being behind and when do you start actually diving into artistry, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
I know when I kind of decided I was serious, I had been serious about violin for a long time. And so when I stopped taking violin lessons, that was like the big deal. It's like, okay, no, it's just oboe. So
yeah, and those decisions feel so big when you're young because you don't have perspective. You don't have the time and the experience to experience this was the right thing or this was the wrong thing. And you don't have like the time to say, oh, not every decision is life or death. So it can feel really intense for young people as they're going through these really big decisions. Like, what do I want to major in? Where do I want to go to college? It feels like, oh, but in the end, you kind of end up where you need to be, or at least you can make the best of where you end up.
Yeah, definitely.
I knew I wanted to be a band director. So like, band was a very central part of my social life. It's where all my friends were. My band director was my favorite teacher. And so I was like, I'm going to major in music ed. That was a pretty organic thing. I had, speaking of catching up, a lot of catching up to do. I didn't start playing the bassoon until I was a junior in high school. And even though I was instantly taken with the instrument, we still couldn't afford private instruction. So my freshman year of college, I had an orchestra director who was pretty hard on me and said some pretty harsh things. And I was kind of at this impasse where I had to decide if I was going to, lean into being a bassoonist or what. And I decided that I was going to make him give me an A. I was going to make him take back everything he had said. And that's when I started practicing, 3, 4, 5 hours a day. And when you do that, you see improvement really fast. And it becomes this kind of, concept of self and something that makes you feel good. And it takes on, and I'm not a proponent actually of our musical identity equaling our personal identity, but at that point in time, it was this well of positive reinforcement, and it was a smaller music department, so they didn't have someone who was blowing into the right end of the bassoon for like 10 years. Everyone's like, oh, that was so wonderful, and yes, give me more.
Yeah.
So that's how I shifted to like performance, and it took on its whole a life of itself in terms. But I originally thought I was going to be a music educator.
And you are, really.
Yeah.
I am. Big kids instead of little kids.
Yeah. What schools did you attend and why?
I actually did have a huge why. I went to the Hart School of Music because, everywhere that I auditioned, I kind of got, not everywhere, there were some places I hardly got any scholarships, so I wasn't considering them, but of the places where I got the most scholarship, when I had taken a lesson with Bert Lucarelli at the Hart School, I was so in. He was just, still is, just the most nurturing, caring, wonderful person and teacher. So I ended up going to the Hart School and studying with him. I went in as a double major, music ed and performance, and I hated all my ed classes, so I dropped music ed and just leaned into performance because I loved my lessons. I loved practicing, and all of my music ed stuff, I was like, I don't want to do I don't want to do this. Nothing against music educators because they are doing God's work, but it was not for me. And then the only grad school I got into was the University of Texas at Austin, where I got to study with Becky Henderson, which was just so different. The Hart School was really, really small and a very intimate studio atmosphere. And then you go to UT and it was in the middle of Texas with all of these amazing oboists. And it was definitely a culture shock, but it really helped me grow. Mm-hmm. And then I took a year off. I taught preschool, decided that I needed to go back to school and get my doctorate because I didn't want to teach preschool anymore. So I ended up auditioning for Eric Olson at Florida State. And he is one of the greatest influences in my life. I owe my career to him. So it was fantastic. And I met my wife at FSU, so it was great.
All the great stuff.
I started at a small state undergrad, Eastern Washington University, and I went there because it was cheap and close. And as soon as I got serious, I became a big fish in a little pond. And so I wanted to go somewhere where the orchestras were playing Mahler, and I wanted to go to a big music school. I really bought into the mystique of the East Coast Conservatory and idealized that. And so I applied exclusively to those and ended up going to Boston University, where I studied with Matthew Ruggiero of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, who has since passed away, but was a very wonderful mentor and teacher. And got to play Mahler, got to play in Symphony Hall and those, big choral orchestral works and all that stuff. And though I loved that experience, I never wanted to be an orchestral player. It was kind of an interesting choice, actually, for someone who knew they wanted to be an academic. The things you do before you have a frontal lobe, it's wonderful. I'm very proud to be alumni, but it was a very orchestrally focused program. You lived and died by your seating in the orchestra and what parts you got assigned and that type of thing. And I knew I wanted to be in higher ed. I knew I wanted to be a bassoon professor. So for my doctorate, I was looking at going into a DMA program that could make me employable. And I knew I still had quite a bit of work because it was so orchestrally based. I knew I had work fundamentally as a player that needed to get done or it wasn't going to get done. Mm-hmm. I knew I had a reed education that really needed to be revamped. There it was kind of like, I don't know, figure it out. I'm here to teach you the bassoon. I'm not here to teach you reeds. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up looking at the Midwest because after Boston, we needed something affordable. Mm-hmm. And the door opened at the University of Iowa. And so I went there as the Bassoon studio TA, and it ended up being the best decision of my life. My mentor, Benjamin Quelio, again, I owe my career to him. I owe the ability to pay my bills to him. And anything I have given my students since is a result of what he invested in me. So yeah, I bleed black and gold, baby. I love the university.
What's something that both of you struggled with during your undergraduate degree?
For me, I think the biggest thing was comparing myself to other people. That was really, really challenging. I was just the most anxious, stressed out, negative, like the mental chatter was a lot. And it was like that for a long time. I'm proud to say I finally, in the last year, have gotten on anxiety medication, which has helped a lot. So I don't know if anyone needs to hear this, but it can help you a lot. But for me, it's the imposter syndrome, the negative self-talk, not treating myself with any kind of kindness or forgiveness, expecting myself to be perfect all the time, and wrapping myself too much in my identity of like, if it's not perfect, it's worthless. That was probably for me the biggest problem. And fortunately for me, as you know, as I've kind of eased into my mid 30s now, it kind of smooths out on its own. So, you know, that anxiety and that, you know, upheaval inside definitely did not continue. You know, I hope it doesn't resurface, but I can say that it has quieted down a lot as I'm more comfortable in my job, in my career, in myself. That was definitely the hardest thing for me.
Is that something both of you see in your students a lot?
Yes, although I think that it shows up in different ways. I grew up in Connecticut. I was very much like East Coast, especially like until I graduated my undergrad, and so it was very much you must get an orchestral job. And like Jackie said, for her, an orchestral job is not a good fit, and it wouldn't have been for me either. So I think that was also, that cognitive dissonance was the cause of a lot of stress. And my students now in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, they don't all want to be orchestral musicians. A lot of them want to be educators in public schools. A lot of them have completely amazing and interesting career goals, just totally creative and fusing all different aspects of their identities. And I see a lot of hope in that, in what's going on, in what I see in my students today, because I didn't really have that as a younger person. It was very much like, this is success, everything else is failure. And I see a lot more diversity now in what success is. And maybe it's because I felt like that when I was younger, is that I try to encourage them to not box themselves in like that, you know, try to encourage growth mindsets. And I don't see it as bad. I do see it, but I don't see it as much. It could also be that we're more connected now with the internet, and there is a lot greater sense of community than there was when I was going through it. What do you think, Jackie?
Yeah, I think the knife cuts both ways. Like, there is such great community, but I also feel like there is an emphasis on validation, external validation, that I see in my students, and a fear of being wrong or being criticized or whatnot. That I was gonna say, like, my struggle, I think, was I put my value in the wrong place. Like, I got my dopamine hit from, okay, it says quarter equals 144 and I will make it equal 144, or I will win the competition, or I will play higher, faster, louder. And it wasn't about artistry at all, because all of my value was in that dopamine hit of doing it right.
Mm.
And I think the internet plays into that a lot, because, you put up the picture on Instagram and it gets likes or it doesn't, or, the thing gets shared or it doesn't. And I see in my students a lot uh, that fear and that need for validation can seep into the learning process in ways that I wish it wasn't in that space necessarily. We are performers, we are in a competitive field, so it has to get introduced in some ways at some point, but I feel it in the studio and in the classroom a lot, where I find myself internally saying, like, you're not invited in here. I'll even look at my students and say, this isn't a stage. And I'll like stop those and I'll look into, this isn't a stage. Because it can cut both ways in terms of the beauty of validation and then turning into something else.
Yeah, I totally see that too, actually. The fear of experimentation and the fear of failure, the fear of criticism. Yeah, I do see that too.
I know as a student, I definitely have fear of kind of having opinions about music, because I'm like, oh no, I'm learning, it's all good. Like, I have to respect every composer, and just, so I know I have trouble voicing opinions about the actual music, because I'm like, I don't know anything yet, so, which is true, but I also do know some, enough to have opinions sometimes, which we can forget.
Or have the growth mindset to, do the work to form your opinions, to recognize that you don't have an opinion yet, but then listen to a bunch of recordings and read a bunch of articles and talk to different people and figure out what your opinion is.
Very good point. Did either of you consider a career outside of music?
Yeah. When I graduated with my master's, I was just living in Austin for a year, and I was miserable in a job that I hated. I had a lot of hang-ups, like mental hang-ups in my playing, and I really felt pretty like tore apart about the oboe. And so I decided that I was going to quit and I was going to apply for nursing school. I was just going to be in Austin and go to community college and get a nursing degree of some kind and do something else that I thought I would be good at. And then I had scheduled a lesson with Becky Henderson. It's confusing because my wife's name is Becky. So when I say Becky, it's, but Becky Henderson. I had scheduled a lesson for her for the fall, for the first fall that I was out of school. And I was really stressed out about it because her expectations are very high. She's an incredible artist and musician. And I hadn't been practicing, but I had been listening. I'd been listening a lot, kind of from this very wounded, emotionally raw place. And so I went to the lesson and I was, going to play for her and then intending to tell her that I was going to change direction. And her comments after hearing me play were, "What happened? I have never heard you sound this good before." And I was like, "Excuse me?" I was like, "I'm about to quit and become a nurse because I'm so unhappy." And she said, "I really think that you should give this, whatever this is that's going on here, I really think you should give this a chance." And that's when I decided to go on and do my doctorate. And I'm so glad that I did, because the job that I'm in currently, working with the students that I'm working with, is really just a fantastic fit. It's a fantastic fit for me personally. I don't sit in one spot very well. So when I'm teaching, I can move around. I can, get high energy, and it's very much like fits within what I feel happy and comfortable doing personally.
Yeah, I never did. And I wish I had. Like I said earlier, where it became about like very specific goals and reaching specific goals. When I became a performance major, I knew, and then I will get my master's, and then I will get my doctorate, and then I will get my first job. And then if necessary, I will start working my way up the ladder to the job I want. And that has always been my mindset. Mm-hmm. And for a very long time, I thought of that as an asset. But I see now, one, that I wasn't always focused on learning. You know, it often was a notch in the belt mentality. And two, I remember my first lesson with Matthew Ruggiero, and he asked me like, well, what do you like to do? What are you interested in? And I said, well, I love opera. I'm looking forward to being in the city so I can hear opera. And I'm interested. And I started listing all these things about classical music. Mm-hmm. And he just stopped and he looked at me and goes, Jaqui, there's much more to life than music. Mm-hmm. And it was unattractive to him to have a student who didn't have things they were interested in reading or watching or new ideas. It was too single-minded. And I now realize that that is correct. And it actually, even mindedly focused on being a great musician, having outside interests will only make you better, and cultivating other parts of yourself. But also, and I don't know that I've even really started to unpack this until recently. I didn't start doing this work until I was with Benjamin, but I don't know that I've really dug in the way I have since I started meditating. I won't go off on a woo-woo tangent, but, you know, even this pandemic, it makes us, we have to think about who we are outside of how we play the instrument. And, you know, on our podcast, we interview people all the time, and we have guests who are cancer survivors and car accident survivors. We've had friends who've gone through issues that affect their dexterity in ways that are relevant to how they play the instrument. And all of them have kind of come back around to a place where they can be performers. But what if they hadn't? Mm-hmm. You know, if Nancy Ambrose King's car accident had been more severe, she would have had to find a way to be a human and a person, and to have a concept of self that had nothing to do with the oboe. And so I never considered a career outside of it, but I'm now realizing that is a con, not a pro. I should have been cultivating other areas of myself along the way. Well, and now I can name like 20 things
I was going to say, you've more than made up for that.
I think as a student or a younger student, it's also really nice to hear from professionals that they like well-rounded people or people who are interested in other things, because not every professional musician feels that way. And I think I sometimes feel like the cognitive dissonance of like, am I supposed to like care about other things, or am I supposed to like listen to more oboe music? And it can be hard to know what the balance is supposed to be or should be for each person.
Right. It's really tough to, you know, it's again that comparison game of what am I doing, and is what I'm doing sufficient to get me toward my goals? And if you don't have the experiences yet, then you don't have any idea, and all you can do is compare yourself to other people, which is so unhealthy and demoralizing and very easy to do, especially on social media where we only post the good stuff.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that speaks so much to the importance of fit in terms of finding a private instructor. Our field is unique in that we're an apprentice-based mode of instruction, and our mentors are typically multi-year, if not lifelong, relationships. And so, yeah, I know how Benjamin and Dr. Ruggiero feel about certain things, and that's why they're a good fit. Mm-hmm. I was doing one of these Zoom like masterclass things about like finding a job, and I said something about telling a joke in an interview, and or imbibing humor. And one of the participants followed up and was like, I wouldn't want to be unprofessional. It's like, well, no, don't do anything unprofessional. But if I'm inclined to float a joke out there, my humanity, and a search committee is like, ugh, no, then that means I shouldn't work there.
Yeah.
Because they'll feel that way when I'm in a faculty meeting, they'll feel that way when they observe my teaching. But if that works well with somebody, then it's probably a great fit. And that's why, when you're considering where to study these lessons, these get to know you lessons, and looking at someone's career and what they prioritize, for some people, the intensity of, no, you must be listening to oboe recordings all the time and do nothing else is how they work. Mm-hmm. And for certain people at certain stages in development, that's what they need. They maybe, struggle with discipline, or it's not inherent to them to make routines for themselves or to carve out certain schedules and that type of thing. And a teacher who spells out A, B, C, and D, this is what I expect of you, and this is a non-negotiable, could be a real asset. For someone like me who defaults to very intense and I kind of white knuckle my way through life, a teacher like that is not what I need. It's going to, it's going to rob me of my joy. Mm-hmm. And so having teachers who kind of explained the way to enjoy music by letting go and feeling comfort and trusting myself was the balance that I needed. But for a different type of personality, it wouldn't provide enough maybe. And so it really is about finding the right fit for who you are at the time and what you
Absolutely.
want,
Mm-hmm.
Don't study with someone whose career looks different from how you want to, how you want yours to look.
1,000%.
I've never heard before to consider schools or teachers just through kind of your energy or like what you need to be matched by that person.
If you are looking for a place to study, you really need to have a lesson with the person that you will be studying with before you sign on the dotted line. Okay. If it's a Zoom lesson, if it's, it doesn't matter how fantastic the teacher is. If it's not a good match, it's going to do more harm than good.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Would you both consider starting your podcast to be a either detour moment or a switch in your career focus?
I don't think so. I think it's pretty in line with how we both approach music and community. Mm-hmm. We started Double Reed Dish because we saw a hole in the resources that are available to people who are not close to a major metropolitan area. Mm-hmm. For example, I'm in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. New Orleans is 2.5 hours away, and I know that my students are going to have a really hard time driving 5 hours to hear an orchestra concert. Atlanta is 6 hours away, right? Nashville is at least 6. So if you are not exposed to different points of view, different ideas of what the career could look like, different teaching perspectives, that you have no idea if that's a good fit for you or not. You have no idea what is even out there, So we really wanted to create a resource that would be an equalizer in a way, where if you have access to the internet, you can listen to conversations of people all over the world who have all kinds of different careers and ideas and practice techniques and what they listen for on the other side of the screen and what their discomforts were. And, towards the beginning, in our first season, especially, we asked a lot about performance anxiety, and we asked a lot about imposter syndrome. And a lot of the people that we talked to said they still deal with that. And that is something that has been really meaningful to a lot of our listeners, and to me especially, is to think, okay, well, this is normal. Mm-hmm. It's uncomfortable, but it's normal and it's fine. So yeah, that was one of the big reasons that we started it. And that's very much in line with, I think, who Jaqui and I are as teachers and as musicians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's really important to us to present an intersection of the field in terms of that. So we try to have, guests who are just embarking on their careers and guests who are at the twilight of their careers, and women and men. And, unfortunately, there's not as much options for racial diversity as we would like. And unfortunately, we actually have to have conversations in which we plan, okay, it's not an option for us to go like 4 years without having a person of color. So we can't ask, we need to distribute, we need to stagger enough so that there is regular representation. And also we don't want it to be too US based. We want to have, international musicians as well. And then, it shouldn't be all academics. It shouldn't be all orchestral. It should be, all sorts of different types of career paths as well.
It's definitely a very big goal you've set for yourself. You're doing a great job. So, one person who did comment on your all's post, their question was, how much time passed between thinking up Double Reed Dish and the first episode?
What was it? 1 month?
Yeah, we both like podcasts.
Yeah, like too much. We like them too much.
This is the podcast.
We had joked about. Yes. We had joked about starting one, just like, two girlfriends talking, we should start it. And like, no one cares about that. Who are we to have people listen? But we'd always like, we should do that. That would be fun. And one of the podcasts we had in common that we both just loved was called Call Your Girlfriend. Mm-hmm. And it's a feminist, woman-centered podcast. And one thing they were always harping on was more women need to start podcasts, and more women need to create content, and they need to get paid for the content that they create. And they were just very adamant in their message about that. So that was kind of always this message. And we were driving out, actually Galit and I were playing with our friend Corey, a trio at College Music Society National Conference. And my husband was also playing, and he's a percussionist. And so he had to provide his own marimba. So we drove from Missouri to New Mexico. We had a lot of time to talk on the trip. And I was talking about, because Galit had dabbled a little bit in like recording some interviews, and she was feeling like, I don't want to speak for you, but maybe like it wasn't as structured as it needed to be successful. And I was kind of saying, we bounce off each other in a really good way. There isn't a Double Reed podcast, like clarinets have them, have them, blah, blah, blah. And too bad it would be way too much work. And he just goes, would it be though? Like, if you set a schedule that was reasonable, and once you figured it out, it could actually be easy and something that could, serve a lot of people. And I went, you're right. And I kind of started thinking like, yeah, we could do it. And I sent her a text and I said, we're doing a Double Reed podcast. We're brainstorming this weekend. And so, yeah, we were at a salad bar place and we came up with the blueprint.
Ignored everyone else at the table. Just decided
so rude.
On our podcast.
And then we said, if we're going to do it, we have to do it. Like we could organize and get things ready for a million years. But if we don't set a date that we're going to launch by, it won't happen. So that was in November. That was just before Thanksgiving.
Yep.
And we go,
no,
December
it was
1st?
the beginning of November.
It was beginning. So
it
maybe
was beginning
we're
of
driving
November.
now.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was, yeah. And then we decided to launch December 1st. Yeah.
Wow.
And you can hear it.
Oh my God, the audio is so bad. We should have those.
We need Disney to put it back in the vault and bring it out remastered. And we were figuring it out.
God
we did.
Bless. It got better. It got better.
Yeah,
growth mindset.
Growth mindset. There you go.
Because I started my podcast through a school project that actually
that is so cool.
Thank you. But it actually made it take forever. So I had like a year that I had to plan it. And I like couldn't do anything, and I had to do multiple papers of like every question I was going to ask people
Whoa.
and how long they were going to be and everything. And that almost made it harder for me when it was actually time to record, because I was like, what?
This is the culmination of a year's worth of
Exactly.
work. Yeah.
And it was just like too much detail that a podcast would actually need to have to start. So I was like too prepared for it to start. But now that I'm out of school, I'm able to do more what I want with it. But
well, it's a brilliant idea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know Double Reed Dish was one of my inspirations for sure.
Yay!
When I was looking at grad schools to apply to, I listened to every episode of a teacher that I was potentially going to take a lesson with. And I felt like I already got to know them before I met them in person, which gives you such an advantage. And so that's kind of what I ended up doing for my undergraduate university. And I have 31 episodes of faculty from that school with every single like area and every emphasis. And now I guess I'm not really helping that, but I think for an incoming student, I know for me that was super beneficial with Double Reed Dish. So I hope that this podcast can be helpful for people in all the same ways. Do either of you have significant moments in your life where you can look back and think, that's when my career really changed, or that's when my career took a path I wasn't expecting?
Yes. So when I graduated from my doctorate, I ended up sticking around Tallahassee for a couple of years, again, in a job that I didn't like. I was like cashier customer service at a grocery store. And my teacher's wife, Deloise, would come into the store, and she would see me every once in a while for 2 years. And she would go home and be like, Eric, she's still here. Like, we gotta get her out of here. We gotta help her out. So one summer, was it like May or June, Jackie? Oh boy.
Okay.
It was June.
It was June. My mentor, Eric Olson, I'm so sorry, my puppy is very excited. My mentor, Eric Olson, called me up and he said, have you seen that UW Platteville opening? And I said, yeah, I probably won't apply for it. I'm just, I was really, unhappy and depressed and all of that happens when you get out of school. And he said, well, I already contacted them and told them you would apply. So you need to do it today or else I'm going to look like a real loser. And I was like, okay. And then it turns out that my soon-to-be good friend Jackie Wilson was on the hiring committee.
Aww.
And it was so late that I ended up being hired off of the phone interview. I didn't even have to go out there because there were no students to demonstrate teaching for. And that moment changed my life. I met these incredible friends that I will have for the rest of my life. And I was able to springboard into a tenure track position after 1 year, which was so lucky and so needed. And, Jackie and I have evolved to be family. So it was that moment where he said, you got to apply today. Otherwise I'm going to look like a real joker. I was like, okay. That was a life-changing moment for me. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I remember I was reading Tina Fey's Bossy Pants right around the time that Galit was hired. And she talks about the moment that she met Amy Poehler in the SNL writers room, and like Jimmy Fallon says something snarky or whatever, and Amy Poehler like snaps back and it's like shuts him down. I forget exactly what happened, but Tina Fey describes, I'm getting emotional, girl. Okay. That internally, she went, my friend is here. My friend is here. And just saw this fellow woman in this space where she felt like the only one, and it was an accomplishment to be there. She was glad to be there, but what a blessing to not be the only one. And, you know, as a woman of color in academia, in classical music, I remember when we brought on Galit feeling like my friend is here, my friend is here. And I'll always associate that phrase with Galit.
Aww.
Every once in a while, she really tries to make me cry. No, this friendship is one of the, you know, most important things in my life. I said that if the podcast is affecting our friendship, we're dumping the podcast because the friendship is so important. So it's really helped us, you know, keep the lines of communication open, and you know, the relationship that we have is so strong, even stronger now than it was before, I think, because we were able to stay in close contact because of the podcast. It gave us an excuse to grow together instead of apart after we went to different institutions, and I could not be more grateful.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm really proud of is that we are providing for our listeners an example of friendship. You know, we're a competitive field, and again, in my intensity coming up, I often viewed people who did what I did, who do what I do, as a threat sometimes, you know, or I would be needlessly
I think we all
competitive.
do that. I think we all do that on some level.
Needlessly competitive. And I robbed myself of learning from my peers in significant ways, unnecessarily. And I love that not only Galit and I are showing this example of friendship and camaraderie in our field, but also that we're doing it by way of propping up our colleagues and saying, you know, this is Ann Shoemaker and she's like the coolest person in the world. And this is Yuri Alvarez and you're about to fall in love with her. And Baylor shout out apparently, but like, you know, that I kind of feel in some ways like we're making up for lost time, because it's just basically like we're stronger together, and when we shine, our field shines. And so, you know, that's one thing I'm proud of.
Definitely. I do like how at the beginning of your episodes it is kind of like catch up, and I feel like I know a lot about you. All of your listeners.
That has bit us in the butt a few times. Like I'll be doing a master class and I'll tell some story and they'll be like, I know. Like, oh, okay. I know you said that already. No, but I think that, do you remember when we interviewed Kristen Wolf Jensen and she said all boats rise with the tide?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, for real.
I feel like I could talk to you all forever, but I think my last question would be if you have current goals for your job, studio, or field, or podcast.
One goal I have for myself is to look at where we are as a world and as a field and as artists with optimism instead of fear. When this pandemic started, I would hear the phrase, things aren't going back to normal. And it would send a surge of adrenaline up my body, and it would make me feel panicked, and it would make me feel upset. And I have shifted my thinking to going, you know, no, we won't go back to normal, because I think about the ways, you know, if 2020 summer had gone the way it was supposed to, I would have seen my colleagues at IDRS and then not otherwise. And I would have collaborated with them and exchanged ideas for them for a week and not otherwise. And because we're all in this isolation and not able to travel, our field has found a way to spend the entire summer in webinars and panel discussions and symposia and virtual this and that. And I've seen more of my Bassoon peers than I have before. And if that's one of the ways we're not going back to normal, by having more community with each other and by making sure to exchange and by going, well, different. So we're going to have to be creative because we're going to have to make a way for us as musicians. If we could do that in the pandemic, then we can do it in a post-pandemic world. And what if that means we're even more inventive and more creative and more interdisciplinary? Then that's exciting to me. Then that means we're trying to become increasingly relevant. And the events of the last month have shown us we need to get relevant to a world beyond classical musicians, and we need to get relevant beyond dead white man Europe. And if this pushes us to be inventive and creative, then I'm excited to not go back to normal. That doesn't mean that they're gonna, bulldoze Carnegie Hall. It doesn't mean that we're gonna throw Beethoven out with the bathwater. So I guess my goal for myself is to go, I'm excited to come out of the other side with the community and creativity that we have gained during this time and view that as an asset as opposed to a detriment.
I'm going to say that's my answer too. I can't follow that up with anything better.
Community property.
Thank you both so much. This meant a lot to me. I feel like there's so many more things I could ask you, but there could always be another Double Redish interview.
Oh, we'll do it anytime. We love talking. Laura, congratulations. This is such a cool project.
You rock.
You rock. You're such like an enterprising, exciting young person.
Thank you.
Lifting each other up isn't just an on-air endeavor for us.
Well, thank you both so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Laura. It was a real pleasure. We're honored.
Thank you, Galit and Jaqui, so much for taking the time to talk with me. I feel like I got a lot out of the interview, and I hope my listeners do too. Also, thank you to Philip Hill, who submitted the question through Instagram. If you'd like to keep up with the podcast, there are multiple ways you can do so. First of all, you can go to our website, which is detoursandmusicpodcast.weebly.com. You could also subscribe to our YouTube channel, also called Detours and Music Podcast. We also have a Facebook page and Instagram account where you can like and follow us. The Detours and Music Podcast is available everywhere that you listen to podcasts, but on Apple Music podcast apps, you can subscribe and rate us. If you ever want to get in touch with me and give more direct feedback, you can email me at detoursandmusicpodcast@gmail.com. As always, thank you for listening, and I hope you catch the next one.